Buenos días. Buenos días, bienvenidos a nuestro 19º Día de la Competencia, organizado por la Fiscalía Nacional Económica. En esta ocasión lo hemos titulado Nuevas, tendencias en el análisis de operaciones de concentración. Saludamos y agradecemos a las autoridades que nos acompañan, al presidente, ministros y ministras del Honorable Tribunal de Defensa de la Libre Competencia, a los jefes de servicio, a las autoridades del Ministerio de Economía y a los expositores internacionales de hoy. También agradecemos a todas las autoridades de agencias de competencia que nos acompañan y, por supuesto, a todos los que están presentes hoy de forma virtual. Ahora dejo con ustedes al Fiscal Nacional Económico, señor Ricardo Riesco, quien dirá algunas palabras.
Muchas gracias, Francisca. Muy buenos días a todos y bienvenidos al 19º Día de la Competencia de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica. Como institución, hemos realizado este evento de manera ininterrumpida durante 2 décadas, salvo en el año 2019 a raíz del estallido social. No se trata de un mero ejercicio teórico o académico, sino que ha permitido orientar y proyectar el quehacer de la Fiscalía desde que la institucionalidad de libre competencia de nuestro país adquirió su actual fisionomía en el año 2003. Por eso mismo, quisiera agradecer hoy que nos acompañen Ryan Danks, Director of Field Enforcement de la División de Competencia del Departamento de Justicia de los Estados Unidos, y Paulo Ibáñez Colomo, profesor de Competencia y Regulación de la Facultad de Derecho de la London School of Economics del Reino Unido. En un mundo globalizado, en que muchas compañías, negocios y transacciones tienen dimensiones transfronterizas, me parece que ambos son invitados de lujo, especialmente habiendo transcurrido poco más de 5 años desde que se implementó exitosamente a nuestro juicio el sistema preventivo de control de operaciones de concentración en Chile. Antes de comenzar nuestra actividad principal, queremos aprovechar la oportunidad para realizar un breve balance de lo que ha sido el actuar de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica durante los últimos 4 años y para dejar constancia de los que, en nuestro concepto, constituyen los principales desafíos para que la institución pueda seguir cumpliendo su misión legal, defender y promover uno de los pilares del orden público económico de nuestro país, como es la libre competencia en los mercados. Estos últimos años han sido tremendamente duros para todos y, por qué no decirlo, también para la Fiscalía Nacional Económica. Por un lado, el estallido social de octubre de 2019 volvió a poner en el debate público los abusos empresariales, reflejados entre otros en la colusión, que hasta el día de hoy continúan siendo una de las principales causas de evidentes síntomas de irritación, pérdida de cohesión social y de confianza en nuestro sistema económico e incluso democrático. En la práctica, eso se tradujo en múltiples iniciativas legales que pretendían entregarle más herramientas a la Fiscalía, revisitar el mecanismo de criminalización de la colusión e incluso en un proceso para dictar una nueva constitución que podría haber generado impactos sustantivos en nuestra institucionalidad, tal como lo advertimos en su momento. Asimismo, todo este periodo implicó un aumento exponencial de la carga de trabajo de la Fiscalía, producto de denuncias parlamentarias y ciudadanas sobre la supuesta comisión de los más variados ilícitos anticompetitivos. Por otro lado, la crisis económica y social causada por la pandemia del COVID-19 incrementó aún más el número de denuncias, ahora a raíz del proceso inflacionario que afecta a nuestro país. Pero sobre todo, ese evento nos obligó a trabajar virtualmente para garantizar en todo momento y bajo todas circunstancias la continuidad de este servicio público, pese al impacto que generó las investigaciones de la Fiscalía, ya sea por las mayores demoras para obtener información o por las mayores dificultades para realizar diligencias probatorias, como por ejemplo, medidas intrusivas en casos de colusión. Y por último, ambos fenómenos históricos, que insisto, incrementaron sustancialmente las exigencias de la institución, se dieron en el marco de una disminución progresiva del presupuesto anual de la Fiscalía. Pese a todos estos problemas, como Fiscalía Nacional Económica estamos orgullosos de haber sido una de las pocas agencias de competencia del mundo que nunca cerró sus puertas, que siempre cumplió sus plazos y que además, durante todo este tiempo, incrementó su productividad a niveles históricos. Efectivamente, y medido a través de parámetros objetivos como son las metas de eficiencia institucional o MEI, nunca antes en la historia de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica Se habían realizado tantas acciones y en tantos mercados que durante los últimos 3 años. Y la verdad es que esto nos llena de orgullo porque en una época de crisis generalizada en las instituciones, con humildad creemos que la Fiscalía Nacional Económica, con hechos concretos y verificables, demostró a la ciudadanía que sigue siendo una institución republicana del Estado de Chile que constituye prenda de garantía. Prenda de garantía de independencia del gobierno de turno, cualquiera sea su signo político. Prenda de garantía de su carácter técnico cuando actúa ejerciendo sus atribuciones. Prenda de garantía de cumplimiento irrestricto de la ley, cualquiera sea el mercado y los agentes económicos involucrados. Y prenda de garantía de sobriedad, porque la Fiscalía Nacional Económica huye de las espectacularidades y del efecto medial efímero, interviniendo siempre a través de los mecanismos y las instancias oficiales que son pertinentes en cada oportunidad. En términos generales, no cabe duda de que en el futuro esas son características que la Fiscalía Nacional Económica debe defender a sangre y fuego. Y debe hacerlo porque esos atributos son una demostración de neutralidad, de capacidad profesional y, en consecuencia, son condiciones sine qua non para la legitimidad y efectividad de la labor que realiza la Fiscalía. Si cualquiera de estas prendas de garantía no se cuidare y se fuere debilitando en el tiempo, la voz de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica dejará de ser respetada y sus acciones dejarán de contar con respaldo, lo que indefectiblemente se traducirá en una menor competitividad de la industria nacional y en una menor competencia en los mercados chilenos. Esto afectaría las condiciones de vida de todos los consumidores nacionales, sobre todo de los más necesitados. En lo más específico, analicemos brevemente en sus distintas facetas cuáles han sido los principales frutos de la labor de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica durante este periodo. En el ámbito de los carteles, nos esforzamos en mejorar la capacidad de detección de la Fiscalía a través del uso de la tecnología y de la ciencia de datos. Para eso creamos la unidad de inteligencia, que además se ha encargado de apoyar y de dar seguimiento a denunciantes y aportantes de información para ampliar nuestra labor investigativa. Además está decir que la unidad de inteligencia está llamada en el futuro a ser una herramienta de utilización común y transversal a todas las divisiones de esta institución. Adicionalmente, procuramos profundizar las técnicas investigativas de la Fiscalía para recabar mejor evidencia, sobre todo haciendo un mayor y más eficiente uso de las medidas inclusivas. Para esto, la colaboración del Departamento de Justicia de los Estados Unidos y del FBI ha sido crucial. Prontamente, la Fiscalía Nacional Económica podrá mostrar en sede jurisdiccional resultados muy potentes derivados del trabajo institucional realizado en estos 2 primeros frentes. Por último, el foco más importante de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica en materia de carteles estuvo en aplicar con el máximo rigor la última reforma legal del año 2016. Y es así que en octubre del año 2021 presentamos nuestro primer caso por cartel duro, como es el caso de transporte de valores. Este caso es bien emblemático por varias razones. En primer lugar, porque es el primer caso en que se acogió a la delación compensada una ejecutiva de una de las empresas involucradas, lo que demuestra que esta herramienta sigue totalmente vigente y además que las empresas ya no solo compiten entre ellas por ser los primeros en tocar la puerta de la Fiscalía. Segundo, este caso ratificó la decisión de la Fiscalía en orden a perseguir no solo la responsabilidad de las personas jurídicas, sino que también la responsabilidad personal de sus ejecutivos, tanto nacionales como extranjeros. Tercero, es el primer caso en que el Tribunal de Defensa de la Libre Competencia, a petición de la Fiscalía, ordenó que 2 personas naturales requeridas, que no se encontraban domiciliadas en Chile, fueran representadas en juicio por un defensor público. Cuarto, es el primer caso en que el Tribunal de Defensa de la Libre Competencia ordenó, a petición de la Fiscalía, y como medida precautoria para responder a los resultados del juicio, la prohibición de enajenar y celebrar actos y contratos sobre un inmueble de propiedad de una de las personas naturales requeridas. Quinto, es el primer caso en que el FBI nos ayudó a desencriptar un medio de prueba vital para la acreditación del cartel. Y por último, en sexto lugar, es el caso en que la Fiscalía Nacional Económica ha solicitado las multas más altas de la historia de Chile para personas jurídicas individuales, ascendentes en total a más de 60 millones de dólares. Todo esto, en nuestro concepto, demuestra que la Fiscalía persigue y perseguirá los carteles con agresividad, tarea que reviste, por cierto, la máxima prioridad institucional. Hemos sorteado y seguiremos sorteando las barreras tecnológicas o fronterizas que se interpongan en el cumplimiento de nuestro deber legal. De hecho, no por nada la Fiscalía fue nombrada el año pasado como codirectora, junto con Estados Unidos e Italia, del equipo de persecución de carteles de la ICN, institución que reúne a todas las agencias de competencia del mundo. Y no por nada la prestigiosa publicación extranjera Global Competition Review, este de año 2022 le asignó a la Fiscalía un rating de 3,5 estrellas, manteniendo así su mejor posición histórica alcanzada el año recién pasado. Eso sí, hasta ahora la Fiscalía Nacional Económica no ha podido ejercer la acción penal para los casos de carteles duros ocurridos después del 30 de agosto de 2016. Como hemos dicho antes, eso no se debe a la falta de voluntad o a que la Fiscalía no crea en el efecto disuasivo de la sanción penal. La ausencia de una acción penal por el momento se debe única y exclusivamente a que aún no existe en Chile una sentencia condenatoria de última instancia, ya sea del Tribunal de Defensa de la Libre Competencia o de la Corte Suprema, para algún caso de cartel duro que haya estado en vigencia con posterioridad al 30 de agosto de 2016, pero es requisito procesal para su presentación. Como institución estamos conscientes de que las penas de cárcel para quienes se coludan son un anhelo ciudadano cuya postergación causa frustración. De hecho, muchas veces esa crítica opaca gravemente los enormes logros que ha tenido la institucionalidad de libre competencia en Chile desde el año 2004 a la fecha. Es por eso mismo que durante estos últimos años han proliferado distintos proyectos de ley del Poder Ejecutivo y mociones parlamentarias de distintos signos políticos tendientes a revisitar esta materia. No se puede desconocer tampoco que esto también forma parte del programa actual del actual gobierno. Como la fuerza de los hechos siempre termina imponiéndose y como queremos ser un actor relevante en la discusión y eventual solución, ya hemos dicho públicamente, y reiteramos también hoy, que la Fiscalía Nacional Económica está dispuesta a revisar eventuales cambios a las reglas que hoy rigen para el ejercicio de la acción penal derivada de casos de colusión. Eso podría implicar una modificación legal que tendría que estudiarse e implementarse siempre con calma, prudencia, rigor y precisión técnica. Porque pocos países del mundo han logrado una solución satisfactoria que compatibilice el mundo de la libre competencia con el mundo penal. Y como muestra esa experiencia comparada, cualquier solución seria a esta materia debe resolver muy cuidadosamente varios problemas complejos. El primer problema es cómo aseguramos que un nuevo diseño no ponga en riesgo la efectividad que ha mostrado la política pública de persecución de carteles en sede de libre competencia, que Chile ha implementado desde el año 2009 a la fecha, y que durante todo este periodo exhibe un 100% de efectividad ante el Tribunal y o la Corte Suprema, habiéndose impuesto a personas jurídicas multas efectivas que exceden los 150 millones de dólares en total. El segundo problema es cómo cuidamos, con dos instituciones persecutoras, los incentivos para postular al beneficio de la delación compensada, institución que en el mundo entero constituye la principal herramienta para detectar, perseguir y sancionar carteles. El tercer problema es cómo resguardamos la confidencialidad del delator y la información comercialmente sensible de las empresas en un proceso de persecución como el penal, que no contempla reglas de secreto. El cuarto problema es cómo establecemos reglas que incentiven la colaboración entre las instituciones involucradas y también cómo reforzamos los recursos y la experticia del Ministerio Público para perseguir en forma exitosa esta compleja forma de criminalidad. Cualquier solución que no resuelva cuidadosamente estos nudos, revisando la experiencia comparada y sopesando detenidamente las consecuencias de cada regla en esta compleja red de incentivos, pone en riesgo el éxito que hasta ahora se ha alcanzado y producirá, con un grado muy alto de probabilidad, un aumento en la sensación de impunidad que cunde en la ciudadanía. En tiempo en que el combate eficaz contra el crimen desvela, y con razón, a la ciudadanía y al sistema político, la exitosa trayectoria de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica en esta materia da fe de una sola cosa. Es el cuidado en el diseño y aplicación de las reglas, el rigor, la atención al detalle y el método lo que entrega resultados. No el eslogan, no el maximalismo, no los titulares. Además de los casos que se presentarán ante el tribunal, Este podría ser eventualmente uno de los principales desafíos de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica durante el periodo que se aproxima. En el plano de los estudios de mercado, que en este periodo han adquirido gran relevancia pública, nuestro foco ha sido analizar mercados prioritarios para la ciudadanía respecto a los cuales se puedan proponer, como solución a eventuales bajos niveles de competencia, cambios legales que disminuyan el gasto de bolsillo de la población. Nuestros cálculos económicos conservadores demuestran que, de acogerse los cambios legales propuestos por la Fiscalía en la totalidad de sus estudios de mercado, los ahorros podrían alcanzar los 2.000 millones de dólares por año. La verdad es que en este ámbito nuestra experiencia ha sido de dulce y agraz. Por un lado, el Poder Ejecutivo normalmente ha reaccionado de manera adecuada frente a los estudios de mercado de la Fiscalía, reconociendo rápidamente la necesidad de realizar mejoras a la legislación vigente. El estudio de rentas vitalicias y el de textos escolares generaron cambios administrativos que llevaron adelante con premura la Comisión para el Mercado Financiero y el Ministerio de Educación, en este último caso, para mejorar la competencia en licitaciones para adquirir textos escolares para el sector público. El estudio de notario de compras públicas gatillaron inmediatamente proyectos de ley que hoy se encuentran pendientes. El estudio de medicamentos se incorporó inmediatamente vía indicaciones como un insumo muy relevante para un proyecto de ley ya en trámite, como es la ley de fármacos 2. El estudio del gas se tradujo en un proyecto de ley relativo al gas natural, pero habiendo transcurrido ya casi un año, estamos a la espera del envío de un proyecto de ley relativo al gas licuado de petróleo, que constituye un anhelo ciudadano, especialmente en tiempos de crisis económica. Recordemos que si se implementan los cambios propuestos por la Fiscalía, el precio de cada balón de gas en Chile podría bajar hasta un 15%. Esperamos, por último, que el Poder Ejecutivo tenga una buena acogida y recepción respecto al estudio sobre cementerios y funerarias que haremos públicos dentro de este mes de noviembre. Por otro lado, no obstante, tenemos la reacción del Poder Legislativo frente a los estudios de mercado de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica. Si bien la reacción primigenia suele ser positiva, este ímpetu inicial luego se diluye o se desvía hasta desaparecer por completo. Por eso, hasta la fecha, habiendo transcurrido ya más de 6 años desde la existencia de esta herramienta, no se ha transformado en ley ninguno de los cambios normativos propuestos por la Fiscalía Nacional Económica en sus estudios de mercado. Causas pueden haber muchas, ciertamente, pero no especulemos con ellas, sino que vayamos a lo concreto. El proyecto de ley de notarios no ha tenido avance durante estos últimos 4 años. Recordemos que de acogerse a las recomendaciones de la Fiscalía, se generarían ahorros en precios para las personas de hasta 150 millones de dólares cada año. El proyecto de ley de fármacos 2, aunque su tramitación parlamentaria está lista, aún no se despacha para su promulgación por el Poder Ejecutivo. Recordemos que esta nueva normativa, que acogió las recomendaciones de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica, producirá un giro copernicano en la industria farmacéutica y logrará ahorros de hasta un 40% en el precio de los medicamentos que cuenten con una alternativa bioequivalente, lo que, como es sabido, constituye ciertamente una demanda sentidísima de toda la ciudadanía. Creemos que por acá se puede dar inicio rápida y efectivamente a la pretendida reforma de nuestro sistema de salud. El proyecto de ley de gas natural, que solo busca modificar 2 artículos, aún no ha pasado su primer trámite legislativo en la Comisión de Energía del Senado. Recordemos que de acogerse las recomendaciones de la Fiscalía, el precio de cada cuenta de gas natural domiciliario podría disminuir hasta un 20%. El proyecto de ley de compras públicas ha tenido avances, pero aún falta tramitarlo en su totalidad. Recordemos que de acogerse las recomendaciones de la Fiscalía, un cálculo conservador estima que el Estado podría ahorrarse 855 millones de dólares por año. Para ponerlo en contexto, este monto equivale a un 12,5% del costo total de financiamiento para el Estado de una PGU de 193.000 pesos, como la actual, o de un 9% del costo total de financiamiento para el Estado de una PGU de 250.000 pesos, como la que pretende implementar la actual reforma de pensiones. Insistimos nuevamente, tal como lo hicimos en nuestra última cuenta pública. En todos estos casos, el Estado de Chile no ha cumplido su rol regulador en beneficio de las personas, lo que es especialmente decepcionante porque ahí está al alcance de su mano una solución rápida y efectiva a importantes y urgentes demandas de la ciudadanía. Como país, lamentablemente la realidad de los hechos demuestra que, al menos hasta el momento, no estamos aprovechando la poderosísima herramienta que son los estudios de mercado de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica. En el ámbito del control preventivo de operaciones de concentración, que es el tema que hoy nos convoca, durante todo este periodo nuestro foco estuvo puesto en la simplificación y actualización del sistema para que la Fiscalía Nacional Económica pudiera destinar sus recursos a analizar aquellas operaciones de concentración que efectivamente tuvieran un potencial impacto competitivo en el mercado. Para simplificar y actualizar el sistema, elevamos nuestros umbrales de notificación obligatoria, dictamos el instructivo de prenotificación, revisitamos junto al Ministerio de Economía el reglamento de notificación de operaciones de concentración, disminuyendo de manera relevante el volumen de información que se debe acompañar a la Fiscalía y creando, asimismo, un mecanismo ultra simplificado para operaciones de concentración sin traslado. Y finalmente, también actualizamos nuestra guía sustantiva para el análisis de operaciones de concentración, que ya había cumplido una década, para que reflejara de manera más detallada el marco analítico, legal y económico que realiza la Fiscalía, así como para que incorporara su propia jurisprudencia administrativa y la del Tribunal de Defensa de la Libre Competencia. En cuanto al análisis más sustantivo, la Fiscalía tuvo mucha actividad en el mercado de la salud. Prohibimos la fusión entre las dos clínicas privadas de la ciudad de Iquique y además la adquisición de ISAPRE Colmena por parte de ISAPRE Nuevas. El caso ISAPRE marcó la primera vez en la historia que el Tribunal de Defensa de la Libre Competencia ratificó una prohibición de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica. Ahora una de las partes notificantes ha interpuesto un recurso de queja ante la Corte Suprema. Sin embargo, estamos seguros que el profundo análisis fáctico, jurídico y económico que realizaron tanto la Fiscalía como el Tribunal nos permitirá ratificar la conclusión de que esa fusión iba a perjudicar con mayores precios o menor cobertura a los clientes de las ISAPRES, especialmente aquellos ubicados en las regiones de nuestro país. Asimismo, la Fiscalía estuvo muy activa con medidas de mitigación preponderantemente estructurales en mercados prioritarios para la ciudadanía. Así, por ejemplo, en el mercado óptico impedimos que se materializara en el territorio nacional la fusión entre GMO y Rotary Kraus. En el mercado del retail, la Fiscalía sujetó la adquisición de OK Market por parte de OXXO a la desinversión de varios locales a favor de un tercero. Y en el mercado de las telecomunicaciones, aprobamos el joint venture entre BTR y Claro, sujeto a la desinversión de espectro y de los activos de televisión digital de Claro. Por último, durante este periodo, la Fiscalía analizó su primera operación relativa a mercados digitales, como fue el caso Uber Cornershop. A futuro, como Fiscalía Nacional Económica, creemos que el sistema debe seguir implementándose de manera expedita. No queremos, por cierto, ser una traba burocrática que dificulte la realización de negocios en Chile, sino que solo buscamos cumplir con el mandato que nos entrega la ley, analizar en detalle, caso a caso, si una operación es capaz o no de reducir sustancialmente la competencia en los mercados, sin alterar ese estándar legal para hacerse cargo de otros bienes jurídicos como la seguridad nacional, la protección de la industria nacional u otros que, por legítimos que pudieran ser, no son propios de nuestra institucionalidad. En el campo de las conductas unilaterales contra la libre competencia, como abusos de posición dominante y otras restricciones a la competencia, este periodo ha sido especialmente demandante e intenso. Por lo pronto, la Fiscalía literalmente ha utilizado todas las herramientas legales que están a su alcance conforme al Decreto Ley 211 para introducir mayor competencia en el mercado de los medios de pago. Como es evidente, la Fiscalía no cejará en sus esfuerzos que esperamos lleguen a buen término en un tema que es de tanta relevancia para la economía nacional. Se trata probablemente del asunto más largo, complejo y litigioso en la historia de la libre competencia en Chile, que el año pasado además sumó la participación de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica como integrante de la Comisión para la Fijación de Tasas de Intercambio. Asimismo, la Fiscalía mostró en todo este tiempo una especial preocupación por las licitaciones a través de las cuales el Estado asigna concesiones de infraestructura pública, así como por las condiciones de competencia en el mercado post-asignación. Es así como la Fiscalía informó al Tribunal, conforme a la Ley de Puertos, en 6 consultas relativas a condiciones de competencia en las concesiones de infraestructura portuaria a lo largo de todo el país. Para mejorar en el futuro la fiscalización de las condiciones impuestas por el Tribunal, la Fiscalía y el Sistema de Empresas Públicas han suscrito un convenio de colaboración que que implicará una capacitación práctica y permanente a todos los directores y ejecutivos de las empresas portuarias. A su vez, a través de un informe de una consulta ante el tribunal, la Fiscalía logró mejorar las condiciones competitivas de bases de las licitaciones públicas de los terminales terrestres interurbanos de Viña del Mar y de Pedro Aguirre Cerro. Destaca además la guía para la elaboración de bases de licitación pública de terminales terrestres interurbanos, destinada fundamentalmente a las municipalidades y que entrará en vigencia esta misma semana. La Fiscalía también ha jugado un rol muy importante en la implementación de la ley REP o Ley de Responsabilidad Extendida del Productor. Evacuamos informes en el marco de 6 consultas presentadas ante el tribunal para conformar sistemas colectivos de gestión de residuos de distinto tipo. Al solicitar medidas para precaver riesgos coordinados entre competidores, así como también riesgos verticales, demostramos que la protección de un bien jurídico tan relevante como es el medio ambiente puede y debe hacerse siempre respetando la normativa de libre competencia en Chile. Por su parte, el caso BCI y el caso CDF demuestran que la Fiscalía está dispuesta a perseguir ante el tribunal conductas unilaterales que perjudiquen a los consumidores. Y por último, los casos de las empresas procesadoras de leche son reveladores de que la Fiscalía está vigilante de que las condiciones que impone el tribunal en el marco de consulta se cumplan en tiempo y forma por los incumbentes en los mercados. Durante estos 4 años, quizás el ámbito donde mayores innovaciones ha introducido la Fiscalía es en el de la verificación del cumplimiento normativo a través de nuestra recientemente creada División de Fiscalización. En efecto, pese a su corta existencia y a contar nada más que con 6 funcionarios, ya muestra resultados sorprendentes y nos ha confirmado que su creación fue un acierto, porque vino a robustecer la estructura de la Fiscalía. Por un lado, la Fiscalía persiguió ante el tribunal y sentó jurisprudencia respecto a la responsabilidad derivada del incumplimiento del deber de informar o notificar sobre participaciones cruzadas en empresas competidoras. Por otro lado, la Fiscalía Nacional Económica está persiguiendo ante el tribunal la responsabilidad aplicable a las personas naturales y a las personas jurídicas por el incumplimiento de la prohibición legal de interlocución. De hecho, hace pocos días el tribunal aprobó una conciliación con Falabella, que marca un precedente muy valioso en esta materia, porque viene a restablecer la legalidad que debe imperar entre competidores a la hora de designar a sus directores y ejecutivos relevantes. Si los agentes económicos están por el respeto a la libre competencia, creemos que acá no hay 2 lecturas posibles. Los competidores no pueden tener directores o ejecutivos relevantes en común. A su vez, en el caso Disney, la Fiscalía demostró que hace efectiva ante el tribunal la responsabilidad por el incumplimiento de medidas de mitigación y también pretende sentar jurisprudencia y obtener sanciones efectivas por la entrega de información falsa cuando se notifica una operación de concentración. En el caso Bizarro, la Fiscalía sentó jurisprudencia administrativa respecto del estándar para alzar o modificar medidas de mitigación impuestas por la propia Fiscalía. Por último, en el caso Navimac, la Fiscalía demostró que es perfectamente capaz de perseguir ex post operaciones de concentración bajo umbrales en aquellos casos en que mínimos estándares de diligencia y prudencia indudablemente hacían pertinente su notificación voluntaria a la Fiscalía. También cabe destacar que en resoluciones recientes, la Fiscalía ha señalado las condiciones que debe reunir un programa de compliance y en especial las condiciones que debe reunir el oficial de cumplimiento de una compañía. En ese mismo sentido y en línea con nuestra labor de promoción o advocacy, según dan cuenta diversos videos en el canal de YouTube de la Fiscalía, en este periodo hemos puesto especial énfasis en que se adoptan programas de cumplimiento serios, reales y efectivos. Para ayudar a concretar este propósito, de hecho, la Fiscalía inició una consulta pública para actualizar su guía sobre programas de cumplimiento de la normativa de libre competencia, que ya cumplió una década. Invitamos a todos y a todas a enviar sus comentarios a esta guía hasta el próximo lunes. Como se puede apreciar, la Fiscalía ha sido capaz de sortear las aguas turbulentas de los últimos años, profundizando el cumplimiento de la normativa de libre competencia en los mercados nacionales, por la vía de dar aplicación a todas las atribuciones legales que le confirió la reforma del año 2016. Sin embargo, como toda obra humana, la Fiscalía Nacional Económica también tiene amplios espacios de mejora. Estamos conscientes de que debemos ser más eficientes para mejorar el alcance, profundidad y muy especialmente la oportunidad de nuestras actuaciones. Estamos preocupados por la duración de las investigaciones de la Fiscalía y también por la duración de los juicios ante el Tribunal de Defensa de la Libre Competencia. Sabemos muy bien que estos fenómenos causan incertidumbre a los agentes económicos. No obstante, estaría generando falsas expectativas si prometiera que la Fiscalía va a reducir en el corto plazo la duración de sus investigaciones. Eso es imposible si consideramos el aumento exponencial de la carga de trabajo de la institución y a la vez que el presupuesto de la Fiscalía ha ido disminuyendo progresivamente desde el año 2018 a la fecha. El presupuesto de la Fiscalía para el próximo año 2023 es inferior en un 14% al presupuesto que tenía la institución en el año 2018, lo que equivale aproximadamente a 1.200 millones de pesos. Eso implica en la práctica 11 funcionarios menos a contrata y 29 funcionarios menos a honorarios. Comparativamente, eso pone al presupuesto de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica en más de un 10% bajo el promedio de los presupuestos de las agencias de competencia de otros países de Latinoamérica y el Caribe, así como en más de un 66% bajo el promedio de los presupuestos de las agencias de competencia de los países de la OCDE con los cuales solemos y también nos gusta compararnos. Y todos los puestos deben complementarse con que la Fiscalía ni siquiera tiene la libre disposición de su disminuido presupuesto, porque la imposición de reglas sumamente estrictas para usarlo, que tienen la buena intención de resguardar el erario público, han quitado a la institución flexibilidad para reaccionar a tiempo en sus contrataciones, lo que dificulta mucho la gestión institucional. En definitiva, el presupuesto actual de la Fiscalía es igual al presupuesto que la Fiscalía tenía antes de la implementación de la reforma legal del año 2016, es decir, cuando la Fiscalía solo se dedicaba a la persecución de toda clase de ilícitos anticompetitivos, pero no tenía a su cargo el control preventivo de operaciones de concentración y la realización de estudios de mercado. Eso, como es obvio, en el futuro puede afectar el alcance, profundidad y sobre todo la oportunidad del accionar de la Fiscalía en los mercados nacionales. Estos atributos hasta hoy se mantienen gracias al encomiable esfuerzo de todos los profesionales que trabajan en la institución. El llamado simplemente es a no poner esos atributos en riesgo. Eso solo se logra invirtiendo en la institucionalidad del Estado de Chile, que se encarga de proteger y promover la libre competencia. También estaría generando falsas expectativas si prometiera que va a disminuir la duración de la tramitación de los juicios ante el tribunal. La división de litigios de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica, que representa a la institución en todos los procedimientos contenciosos que inicia la Fiscalía ante el tribunal, es decir, que es la que tramitó todos los casos judiciales que he mencionado el día de hoy, puede dar plena fe de que el aumento de las sanciones producto de la última reforma legal del año 2016 generó, como externalidad negativa, un aumento sustancial de la litigiosidad de las partes. Porque cuando hay más en juego, evidentemente que los sujetos pasivos de las acciones de la Fiscalía se defienden con mayor ahínco. Solo a modo ejemplar, ello ha traído aparejado que la Fiscalía Nacional Económica debe defender cada vez más frecuentemente la institucionalidad libre competencia ante el Tribunal Constitucional, cuestión que antes constituía una rara excepción y que además produce el efecto de paralizar la tramitación de los procesos que se siguen ante el tribunal. Entre otras cosas, eso es algo que necesariamente se debe tomar en cuenta por el legislador si finalmente se opta por revisitar los mecanismos de criminalización de los carteles duros. Investigaciones y litigios más dificultosos y largos tienen naturalmente un alto costo alternativo tanto para la institucionalidad como para los mercados y, en consecuencia, para todos los consumidores nacionales. Por otro lado, aprovechamos la ocasión de hacer presente que, sin que se reforme lo relativo a la publicidad confidencialidad de la información que se presenta ante el tribunal, será absolutamente imposible disminuir en los plazos de tramitación de los juicios. Por supuesto que es muy relevante resguardar la información confidencial de los agentes económicos y respetar en todo momento su garantía constitucional a un debido proceso. Pero no se puede pretender legítimamente que se cumplan esos objetivos a costa de poner en peligro la sostenibilidad de la institucionalidad de libre competencia. Tanto la Fiscalía Nacional Económica como el Tribunal de Defensa de la Libre Competencia tienen hoy en día demasiados funcionarios dedicados demasiado tiempo a temas demasiado formales que dificultan demasiado, y la gran mayoría de las veces de manera injustificada, la defensa y protección de la libre competencia en Chile. Por todo lo expuesto, no cabe duda que tanto la recuperación e incremento del presupuesto anual de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica, así como también contribuir a la solución del problema relativo a la publicidad, confidencialidad de los antecedentes que se acompañan al tribunal, serán con mucha probabilidad de los desafíos prioritarios para la institución en el periodo que se aproxima. No podría, ni tampoco querría concluir estas palabras finales sin referirme a todos los funcionarios y funcionarias que forman parte de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica. A todos ellos y ellas. Nada de lo que he dicho el día de hoy sería posible sin ustedes, que son los verdaderos protagonistas de este relato. No tengo más que palabras de agradecimiento y admiración por su trabajo impecable y compromiso restricto con la Fiscalía Nacional Económica y, en definitiva, con el país y su gente durante estos casi ya 4 años de labor en conjunto. Como les digo siempre, el fiscal debe ser la cara visible de esta institución por ley, pero el éxito de la Fiscalía es el fruto del trabajo diario de todos los funcionarios y funcionarias de esta institución. Trabajo diario realizado por todos y todas en un ambiente laboral donde prima la excelencia profesional y la calidez humana, la colaboración, la confianza, el humor y sobre todo la anteposición permanente del cumplimiento irrestricto de las atribuciones legales de la Fiscalía por sobre cualquier otra consideración. Como es evidente, este agradecimiento también incluye a la Asociación de Funcionarios de la Fiscalía e incluso en un lugar preferente, a todas las personas que se encargan de la administración diaria de esta institución, quienes nos permiten dedicarnos a nuestra labor teniendo la certeza de que los recursos públicos se están usando correcta y eficientemente. En épocas de extrema polarización e incertidumbre, me parece que la Fiscalía Nacional Económica es un ejemplo viviente de un grupo de personas que, con una tremenda diversidad de ideas políticas, creencias religiosas y, en definitiva, con experiencias vitales totalmente distintas, son capaces de trabajar armónicamente en conjunto en el seno de una institución del Estado de Chile para defender y promover la competencia en los mercados nacionales, pilar esencial no solo de nuestro sistema económico, sino que también de nuestro sistema político y social, así como presupuesto indispensable para que Chile tenga una economía pujante que mejore efectivamente las condiciones de vida de todos los chilenos y chilenas. Si eso se mantiene así en esta institución, me permito ser optimista respecto del futuro de la Fiscalía Nacional Económica y también respecto al futuro de nuestro país. Los dejo ahora con la actividad principal de este 19º Día de la Competencia de la Fiscalía. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo, por tus palabras y recuento de toda la labor de la Fiscalía en estos años, lograda bajo tu dirección y guía. I will not switch into English, which will be the language of the panel. The topic we chose at the FNE for our 19th competition day is new trends in merger control. So, as Ricardo pointed out, our merger control regime has had quite a few procedural improvements during the last few years, but it has also faced challenges from a substantial perspective. But let me take one step back. Why is particularly important to talk about merger control in Chile today? In 2017, nearly 5 years ago, a mandatory merger control system was established in Chile. And this decision was indeed a competition policy statement. Introducing merger control is a signal that it is relevant to focus on preventing competition to be harmed rather than sanctioning anti-competitive conduct exposed when competition is already hindered, particularly important for a small and developing economy as ours. There is quite a consensus that successful merger control protects competition and that competition is critical for economic development or even recovery, since it provides consumers choices. So when a merger harms competition, we are not facing a legal or economic problem only. Lack of competition can harm real people on a day-to-day basis. It's the consumer's ability to choose which supermarket to shop at or which healthcare provider to go to that can be protected if an antitrust agency is enabled to review some concentrations ex ante. So having an effective merger control regime is not only a matter to be proud of, but it is also a task we need to keep working on at the FNE. We have now the permanent challenge, an opportunity to make the regime become more efficient, faster, and to provide greater transparency and legal certainty. One of the main challenges we face is that while some concentrations could bring benefits to competition, others can excessively consolidate markets and reduce consumers' choice or prevent innovative efforts. So the question is how to provide fast decision-making in mergers with no concerns whatsoever, but effectively detect mergers that can harm competition. As Ricardo clearly stated, the answer lies in our competition's law mandate to evaluate whether or not a concentration is capable of substantially lessening competition in a particular market. This is the legal standard to capture anti-competitive mergers. Therefore, a central challenge throughout these years has been trying to provide meaning to the substantial lessening of competition test and clarity on how and when the legal test is met. We need to avoid false negative by prohibiting harmless mergers, but we also need to prevent clearing concentration that could imply a relevant damage on competition. When merger control was introduced in Chile, the parliamentary discussion held that the legal test was the one that, and I open quotes, more developed antitrust jurisdictions apply when scrutinizing mergers. So since the beginning of the regime, in the task to construe a fair, accurate, but flexible merger control system, we have considered foreign standards and benchmarks when they fit the size of our markets and economic context. And on this, we have been quite inspired on the competition law landscape of agencies such as the United States Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission, the European Commission, and the UK's Competition and Markets Authority. So I believe it is fair to say that in Chile, they have been the role model antitrust jurisdictions that have inspired us to shape our own system. So to discuss about best practices and new trends on merger control from each side of the Atlantic, we are honored at the FNE to have with us today Mr. Ryan Danks and Professor Pablo Ibáñez Colomo. So welcome you both to the Competition Day. We're thrilled to have you in this panel. Let me introduce them briefly. Mr. Ryan Danks is the Director of Civil Enforcement at the Antitrust Division of the United States Department of Justice, where he has held multiple roles since the year 2004. He holds a JD from the University of Michigan Law School. Pablo Ibáñez Colomo is a professor of law and Jean Monnet Chair in Competition and Regulation at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's also visiting professor at the College of Europe, Bruges, joint general editor of the Journal of European Competition Law and Practice, and co-editor of the Chilean Competition blog. He received a PhD from the European University Institute in June 2010, Jacques Lassier Prize. Thanks, Ryan and Pablo, for joining us today. Well, let's start this conversation by addressing which is the state of the art in merger control. So Pablo, could you please start by providing us a general overview of the current landscape of merger control regime at a European level?
Of course, thank you, Francisca. But before I do, let me congratulate the Fiscalía for the past 4 years. So it's become a reference around the world, and it's not a surprise in light of the hard work and the excellence that has been put and highlighted before by Ricardo Riesco. Then, in terms of the invitation, I have to say it's a privilege to be presenting in this forum. And I think the invitation could not have been more timely in more than one respect. Then you were asking me about the landscape in Europe. And what I can say is that the landscape is changing as we speak. So then many of the certainties that we've had for the past, say, 18 years since the last regulation was put in place are being questioned now. And the landscape in Europe is changing in response to the emerging challenges that I will be discussing later, and in particular in the name of effectiveness, which is something, Francisca, that you've mentioned before. Right? Then there have been two main changes that I will emphasize now that are changes of a jurisdictional nature, and there are changes that have to do with the relationship between merger control and other areas of competition. Right? So then what we see on the jurisdictional side now in Europe is a rethink of the sort of mergers that can be evaluated by the European Commission. with a view to ensuring that the European Commission has the effective tools to control mergers that are likely to lead to a significant impediment to effective competition. So then most of the audience will know that in Europe we have a multi-level system whereby mergers that meet certain thresholds will be examined by the European Commission and by the European Commission alone. Concentrations that fall below that threshold, that do not have, as we say in Europe, a union dimension, will be examined by national competition authorities, provided that the national thresholds are met. And in the current landscape, it's quite interesting because some transactions that have the potential to do harm do not meet either the union threshold and do not meet all the national thresholds. So the question that has emerged is, well, what would happen in the case of a merger that doesn't meet the union threshold, but doesn't meet either the national threshold? Can the European Commission examine those? This is a matter that is now being examined as we speak by the European Court of Justice. But if we were to follow the judgment provided at first instance by the General Court, the conclusion that we will reach is yes, the European Commission can examine not only mergers with a union dimension, but also mergers that have been referred by national authorities and which do not meet the thresholds of national authority. So in that sense, we see a trend towards more effective enforcement, and that will be particularly useful, as I will mention later, in relation to digital markets, given how those thresholds are aligned. So this is one trend, and we see that jurisdiction is being interpreted in an expansive manner to make sure that harm is addressed in a meaningful way, and that thresholds do not stand in the way of intervention where intervention is justified. So this is one dimension. The other dimension has to do with the relationship with other provisions and the complementarity with or between merger control and Article 102, the one provision that deals with abuses of dominance, what would be the equivalent of monopolization in the US system. And in that case, we have a pending judgment before the European Court of Justice in the Tower case, which is there to suggest that the provisions on abuse will act as a complement to merger control whenever the thresholds are not met. So in that sense, we have a symbiotic relationship between the provisions on abuse and the provisions on merger control that would allow for effective action and for a complementarity that doesn't leave any gaps, right? So that has been the direction of travel of the past few months, and I think the message is clear. I will develop more when we discuss digital, but I think and hopefully the trend is clear, but we'll be happy to follow up on any points, Francisca, as you like.
Thank you, Pablo, for the interesting remarks on the changes of merger control at EU level. It is interesting that in Chile, in the 2006 reform, we do have the possibility to review mergers ex post when thresholds are not met. So we have that provision in our local law. A central aspect of merger control is indeed remedies and the possibility the parties have to offer commitments and modify their transaction when the agency is able to show that the concentration raises relevant antitrust concerns. And turning to the United States, so Ryan, we see that there has been much commentary on changes on how the enforcement agencies and the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission consider merger remedies. So could you please comment on what has changed and why it has changed? And connected to this, what role do consultations with enforcers in other jurisdictions play in current US merger enforcement?
Sure, would be happy to. First of all, let me start by thanking the FNE for inviting me to join you all this morning and to echo Pablo's congratulations to our host on an outstanding 4 years and to the agency as a whole on the recent enforcement successes that you've had. We recognize that issues like healthcare and health insurance are obviously among the most important to families around the world, and your work has been an important demonstration of the thoughtful and aggressive competition enforcement and the role that it can play in all of our economies. To Francesca's first question about changes in our approach to remedies, I think that remedies are an important issue for a number of reasons, not the least of which it goes to the heart of one of the topics that's going to be talked about throughout this morning, which is what it means to have a substantial lessening of competition. Because in the United States, the point of a remedy is to ensure that after a merger is completed, that there has been no lessening of competition, that the remedy takers have been able to preserve or restore any competition that was lost as a result of the merger. And so how do we think about that in the context of a merger investigation? I think the primary issue that we are focused on is the idea of risk and the risks of failure on the part of the remedy and who should bear them. There are risks that remedies may fail because something about the transfer of assets will damage their ability to be competitive. There are risks that the remedy will fail because the company purchasing the assets will not be able to operate them successfully. And there are risks that the remedy will fail because the changes in the market will leave either the divested firm with less ability to compete or somehow enhance the merged firm's ability to exercise market power. And frankly, underlying all of this is that we have seen too many times when remedies have not worked out. And when they don't work out, the merging parties are often the ones who benefit at the expense of the consumers who depend on us for competition. Therefore, as I said, it is important from our perspective that the risks of any failures in remedies fall to the merging parties rather than to the consumers and the markets we're supposed to be protecting. And I think that the agencies have both made clear, especially the department, that if we do not believe that the remedy adequately addresses those risks, then we will be prepared to file suit. With those principles in mind, there are a couple of procedural steps that we have taken recently to help, we think, address the risks in an appropriate way. First, we have pushed companies to present mergers to us with remedies already in place, or at least substantially in motion. As I have said in other contexts, it is not our job to spend the time or resources necessary to help merging parties fix an otherwise anti-competitive merger. Second, we are going to do fewer consent decrees. We have done and will continue to do fewer consent decrees than the division has done in the past. They are often not worth the time that they take to negotiate, and they're more necessary when the remedy hasn't been agreed to, but those are exactly the situations that we want to avoid. And we do not want to limit our ability to go back and address mergers retrospectively if harms develop that we're not able to foresee at the time of the merger filing. Now, this all ties into the consultations with enforcers in other jurisdictions that Francesca asked about, because of the crucial role that those consultations play in our enforcement process. We see the advantages of talking to our counterparts in the context of merger investigations, because we get a fuller picture of what happens in the potential impacts of the merger in other countries. We get information that we may not otherwise have access to in terms of the views of local industry or the outcomes of market testings done in other jurisdictions. And in fast-paced merger investigations, cooperation helps sensitize us to what other jurisdictions' timelines are and the impact of potential remedies that they are having on the whole of the merger and its impact in multiple countries around the world. These sorts of consultations and collaborations, along with the more policy and procedural level consultations and collaborations exemplified by the competition day that the FNE is hosting this morning, I think help develop good practices across agencies around the world. And they also ensure that we are presenting a united front when there are potentially anti-competitive mergers that have substantial effect in countries both in North and South America, in Europe and Asia.
Thanks, Ryan, for your illustrating remarks. Remedies failure is also a challenge that we face when accepting commitments, and we are also aligned on the relevance of international cooperation for successful remedies. But even before remedies, a key aspect of merger enforcement worldwide is the legal test, and when a transaction could be legally qualified as a concentration that harms competition or anti-competitive. So in most jurisdictions, what the test implies and which is a standard of proof has been shaped by courts, by case law, as a result of litigation in merger prohibition cases. In Chile, as Ricardo mentioned before, a merger can be prohibited when it is capable to substantially reduce competition, a test closely inspired in the ones enforced both in the US and the EU. So, Ryan, in the United States, could you please tell us how do the enforcement agencies, the FTC, the DOJ, and the courts interpret the substantial lessening of competition standard?
Sure. And in fairness, this is a question that could take a couple minutes, a couple hours, or a couple of days to answer. And so I will try to stick to the first of those options. I think the first point on this is just a little bit of legislative history. Our antitrust laws, our federal antitrust laws, were first passed in 1890, and they have twice been supplemented by acts of Congress that were designed to make clear that Congress wanted us to block anti-competitive mergers. And so the legislative support for our merger enforcement regime is quite well established at this point in the law and very long standing. You know, the actual standard is whether a merger may substantially lessen competition. And I think that the may there serves two important purposes. One, it signals that it is something less than likely. We do not have to prove, 50% or more that a merger is going to substantially lessen competition. It is something closer to what the concept in US law is of reasonable probability. Second, and I think, Francisca, this goes back to a point that you made earlier about the importance of preventing harm rather than simply trying to remedy it after the harm has occurred, is that the substantive standard in the US law is forward-looking. It's an incipiency test, and it's focused on what might happen, not necessarily what will happen. As one famous case in the United States put it, it is a predictive judgment that is necessarily probabilistic rather than demonstrable, is what's called for and what we are trying to persuade courts of. Now, I think that there are many, many ways that mergers may substantially lessen competition. And I think that your own Colmena case recently tracks very much the thinking that is reflected in the United States law right now. Generally we think about head-to-head competition and concerns that there will be the necessary reduction in head-to-head competition that is inherent in all mergers will result in anti-competitive price increases in the market. And there are many ways we can assess this. We can look at ordinary course documents between the parties, between the merging parties. We can look at customers and testimony from other market participants. We can look at win-loss data, or in our most formal cases where we have a sufficient amount of information, we can use econometric models like the Guppy that you all have used in the past as well. I do think it's important to emphasize a couple of points about this. First of all, in the United States, there's no one type of evidence that is required. You can make out a head-to-head case based on any one of those three categories of evidence, or maybe even others that I haven't mentioned here this morning. Second, there's no precise amount of harm that is required for us to demonstrate a substantial lessening of competition as a result of the merger. Sometimes the total harm may be quite small in the context of our national economy, and that can be because there are relatively few customers, or the merging parties are relatively small, or the expected price increase that they may be able to take is relatively small. But there is no minimum threshold. It will all depend upon the needs of the case. And I think that that's a good spot for us to be in for a couple of reasons. One, the calculations, even when they are done and done well, may be imperfect. And second, those calculations will invariably miss what may be the greatest harm that results from a merger, which is the loss of the dynamic head-to-head competition and innovation that cannot be easily measured as independent firms respond to market conditions in the future and scramble against each other in order to improve their position and their sales. Finally, just to underline the point about the relative unimportance of thresholds and estimates to harm to competition, the actual oldest type of harm that the US antitrust laws have considered is actually the risk of coordination. And there are cases that go back to the beginning of our merger law talking about how a substantial increase in the size of a company or a substantial increase in the concentration in the markets is likely to lead to greater coordination among the remaining firms. And it's that softening of competition among the remaining firms that is one of the central evils of antitrust, and that we are trying to prohibit. Now, that approach has led to the existence of presumptions in the US antitrust merger law, which are based both on case law and our experience, that a market with few significant competitors are likely to feature coordination, and that coordination will be lessened the fewer the competitors that are available. Naturally, there will be questions in every case about what a few means and what the right threshold has to be. Our merger guidelines have traditionally drawn that line between 4 and 6. I will tell you that as a cartel prosecutor for many years, I have discovered that even industries with greater numbers can be prone to collusion or tacit coordination, and it is something that we should be regularly watching out for. But again, I will close with just the point I made earlier, which I think the nice thing about coordinated effects stories is that they really illuminate nicely the question that you've asked about what a substantial lessening of competition means. No one, so far as I know, has ever presented a precise quantification of a lessening of competition in the context of a coordinated effects case in the United States, and no one has seen a need to, because we all recognize that those sorts of harms can be easily felt, even if they are not always easily measured.
Thanks, Ryan, for your practical look on how to meet the predictive standard of proof in US merger control, and which is the amount of harm has been a matter of discussion in merger control litigation in Chile as well. Turning to the European perspective, Pablo, how can you describe this test that is in the other side of the Atlantic, the significant impediment of effective competition test applied in the European merger control?
Well, thank you. I would say that much of what Ryan has been saying resonates very much with the discussions we're having now. So then the test is relatively young in Europe. So then we're talking about a test that was implemented in 2004. And because of the nature of merger control and the relatively limited judicial review that we see in merger control, many of the fundamental questions remain unanswered as we speak, which I think makes this debate more interesting. And what I would emphasize about Ryan's presentation is the need to ensure a system that is administrable, that we have a set of proxies that allow us to administer in a meaningful manner, in an effective manner, the system. So then we need presumptions, proxies, and so on to implement it, but we need to make sure that we take into account all the evidence. And what we see now in the context of the discussion in Europe is that we're trying to find the balance between administrability, so then a system or a legal test that can be administered in a meaningful way, and one that is accurate, one that takes into account all the relevant evidence in a particular case. Right? So then the distinctive feature against this background of the European test is that it can be administered in two ways. So an easy way and a difficult one. So the easy way is the old standard that is no longer the only reason why a merger can be declared to be incompatible with the internal market in Europe, which is the dominance test, right? So then when merger control was implemented for the first time in '89, the substantive test was based on dominance. And dominance means substantial degree of market power. So this would make the administration of the system relatively easy because the substantive threshold would be high, and it would also be easy in the sense that dominance has an illustrious story in competition law. It's a test that had also been implemented in monopolization cases in the US, so in the EU, sorry. So that means that test was an easy one. But in 2004, a new test was put in place, which has as a practical consequence that mergers below the level of dominance can be blocked to the extent that they lead to a significant impediment to effective competition. In other words, dominance is no longer the only circumstance in which mergers can be declared to be incompatible. And that raises a number of difficulties, some of which have already been effectively presented by Ryan. But then these difficulties come, in particular, I would say, in the context of a horizontal merger. A horizontal merger, that is to say, a merger between actual and potential competitors, by definition, by its very nature, leads to an increase in market power. That means that when we apply a test that is no longer based on dominance, everything hinges on whether this increase in market power is significant or not. We need, in other words, a legal test that makes it possible to differentiate between significant and insignificant impediments to effective competition. And this is proved to be a very difficult task, so much so that the question is, as we speak, pending before the European Court of Justice. And let me just give you a flavor of the terms of the debate as present in Europe. And then we have before the court, as we say, two schools of thought. The school of thought of the General Court, so the first instance court that addressed the issue, and another school of thought that has the European Commission and Advocate General Cocotte that has already looked into the issue. And there's a debate, I think, that captures this tension between administrability and accuracy in a particularly effective way. So the General Court favored a test that is, as I call it, solid in nature. So it's a test that is solid in the sense that it has finite boundaries and is based around two conditions, namely whether the merger would eliminate important competitive constraints between the merging parties, and it would, secondly, lead to a reduction of the competitive pressure on the remaining competitors. And the General Court crafted a legal test around these two fixed conditions and would make mergers conducted or examined by the European Commission subject to the fulfillment of these two conditions. In opposition to this solid test that has two conditions that would be the benchmark against which mergers below the threshold of dominance would be examined, we have what I might call the liquid test that would vary depending on the circumstances, that I think acknowledges that life is more complex, that, as Ryan is saying, there's not a finite set of issues or a finite set of evidence that we're going to contemplate, and that therefore varies from one case to another. In other words, under the liquid test, the factors that are relevant in order to evaluate the lawfulness of a particular transaction will vary from one case to another. We cannot say with certainty that these are going to be the factors that are relevant in the context of a particular case. These may change from one case to another. So therefore, the choice that in a few months' time, the European Court of Justice will have to make is whether to go for the solid test, a finite set of conditions, or a liquid test that allows for a broader number of factors to be considered and allows in particular for a variation in the number of factors that are relevant in the context of a particular case. So hopefully that resonates beyond the EU, and I think that captures, I think, a tension that is very much present in any merger control system around the world.
Thank you, Pablo, for your comments on this. I think it's interesting to see how, rather than contrast, we can find relevant similarities among jurisdictions. The concept of an administrative merger control regime, not to rely on a particular evidence, and a test that goes beyond dominance, is something that had been also in discussion in Chile recently. So the discussion around the legal test is closely linked to the institutional design of merger control. So interior design is quite inspired in the EU, with merger control entrusted to the agency, and only when concentrations are prohibited by the FNE, the merging parties can challenge the decision before the court, a specialized competition tribunal. This has only happened twice, in the sweet snack case and recently in the private insurance healthcare case. So, Pablo, it would be, I think, illustrating to hear from you, which has been the recent European Commission experience when faced with judicial review of merger. You said that there were very few cases, but which has been the most relevant ones on this?
Thank you. I think that ties in very well with what I was presenting. And I think perhaps what I said just a few seconds ago may sound a bit abstract, but I think I might illustrate this debate between the liquid and the solid test, between the tension between administrability and accuracy in light of, I think, the leading case in relation to these matters, the case that is pending before the court, which is the CK Telecoms case. And I think illustrates it very effectively in a number of ways. So this is a merger that was notified by two mobile phone services operators in the UK. So it's a merger that was decided by the European Commission prior to Brexit, and I think illustrates very well the complexities of the analysis of mergers below the threshold of dominance. So in that case, it was a 4-to-3 merger, as we call it. So then the number of mobile phone service providers in the United Kingdom would have been reduced from 4 to 3. And the question was whether this reduction, which would not lead to the creation of a dominant position, would nevertheless lead to a significant impediment to effective competition. And I think this case is notable in a number of ways. First of all, one question that was central, I would say, to the analysis of the General Court, the first instance court that evaluated the transaction is, well, how can we identify problematic mergers and non-problematic mergers? And in that regard, the first instance court expressed concerns, first of all, because it felt the need to define a set of criteria that would not leave any scope for unfettered discretion on the part of the authority. In other words, the legal test would have to be defined in such a way that the authority wouldn't have the power to declare the incompatibility of just any transaction. The line between compatible and incompatible transactions would have to be a clear one. And therefore, we would need a set of factors allowing us to decide in every case whether the impediment to effective competition is significant enough to justify intervention. What did the General Court do? Say, first of all, there can be two main instances in which an impediment is significant enough. First of all, when the merger involves a maverick, that is to say, an important competitive force that goes beyond the competitive constraints that come from other markets players. So in a way, the criterion introduced by the General Court is to say, we need a maverick that adds to the competitive process more than the others. That is to say, that introduces or that injects a degree of competitive pressure that goes beyond the competitive pressure that members of the oligopoly place upon one another. So this could be one hypothesis in accordance with the analysis of the General Court. A maverick and the competitive pressure that is unique coming from the maverick would disappear. A second point would be, or a second scenario in which this merger would lead to a significant impediment, when the parties are particularly close competitors. And I emphasize the word particular, because in that regard, the General Court said the parties should be close competitors in the sense that their closeness of competition, the extent to which they compete closely with one another, goes beyond the closeness of competition that is natural in any oligopoly, right? So then, in a way, or to sum up, the General Court mentioned that the impediment should go beyond the normal degree of competitive pressure that we witness in oligopolies, and the normal degree of competitive pressure that we would mention normally in competitive markets. And then in that sense, it demands an added value. And that is the reason why the merger was declared to be incompatible. So then I think I will put an end. I mean, I might perhaps add a few remarks later if we have time, but hopefully the essence of the tension is clear, right? So that was the choice of the General Court, and now we are waiting to see whether the Court of Justice on appeal validates this approach that places more finite boundaries on the scope of intervention from a substantive standpoint.
Thank you, Pablo. We will, for sure, will be expectant to see what the European Court of Justice will decide in this case. We also had a merger below the threshold of dominance, the Sabres case that was prohibited by the FNE and upheld by the Competition Tribunal, qualified as a transaction that substantially lessened competition. So now turning to Ryan, when a transaction is challenged in the United States before a court and the agencies litigate in order to get the merger blocked, could you tell us a bit how the courts have considered the test of reduction of competition in recent cases, please?
Sorry, I would be happy to. And I have to say, Pablo, I very much enjoyed your remarks on the differences between solid and liquid tests, and we'll have to figure out how to incorporate some of that into our thinking here. I do think that in general, the the points that Pablo highlighted are the important ones that the courts here consider. The closeness of head-to-head competition is obviously can be a major factor, although I will caution that very much depends on how the companies in the industry compete, that there can be situations where if the competition is occurring solely on the basis of output, for example, in a commodity situation, it may be that a more distant competitor can nevertheless be a competitive constraint on a nearby competitor. And so we have to be careful about making assumptions around the closeness of head-to-head competition when we're assessing such things. But in general, courts, to go back to Francisca's question, the courts consider the factors that Pablo and I have been discussing. We have done 5 trials this year by the Antitrust Division involving merger cases, and unfortunately, all of them are still ongoing in one form or another, and so I'm not able to comment on them specifically right now, but I think that if people review the decisions that have been handed down, they will see that they're very much grappling with the issues that we've discussed this morning about the nature of head-to-head competition, about the possibility of coordination or cooperation among the remaining firms, and the role that structural or remedies or behavioral promises may play. Of course, I would point you in particular to the recent decision in the Bertelsmann case, which involved a merger of 2 of the largest 5 book publishers in the United States, as particularly thoughtful discussions of many of these issues. But I thought I would take a minute and actually point back to 2 older cases that I think are useful for people to look at when they're considering these issues. And these were the Department of Justice's health insurance cases that were done 5 or 6 years ago now, involving 2 mergers that were proposed at more or less the same time that ultimately involved 4 of the 5 largest health insurers in our country. And if you look at those 2 cases, one is the Aetna case, the other one is the Anthem case, what you'll see are courts grappling with many of the issues that we have discussed here this morning. In the Aetna case, it was very much a story of head-to-head competition, and it was a very quantified story. There was a lot of data that was available because of the nature of the markets that were contested there, and that data combined with the documentary history and testimony from the merging parties told a pretty clear story about the loss of head-to-head competition between the 2 companies. And importantly, in that case, there was also a remedy that was proposed that the court found to be inadequate, that it said effectively that the remedy that they had tried to take would not restore the competition that was going to be lost as a result of the merger. And I think it established an important point or reestablished an important point of law for us on that. The other notable thing about the Aetna case that I think is important for enforcers around the world to keep in mind, the court there pointed to evidence that one of the companies had tried to manipulate the record at trial by changing its behavior after the merger had been announced. And that is obviously something that we all must be sensitive to, because the evidence that we are looking to is not under our control. It is very often under the control of the parties to the merger, and so we need to be cautious about that. In the Anthem case, the issue that I just wanted to highlight goes back to something I said before, which is the importance of dynamism in these markets, and considering not looking at a market statically and just seeing what the competition is between the two merging parties today, but what is it, what may it be in the future? And there, in that case, you had one of the merging parties that was very much not similarly positioned to the acquirer or to some of the other major players, and as a result was having to offer customers a different combination of services and attributes in order to try to attract business. And one of the concerns that we had, and one of the concerns that is reflected in the court's opinion there, is that the merger would essentially eliminate that. Not only would the company now be under the control of one of the larger, more traditional health insurance companies, but the very nature of its business would change, because it would have access to different forms of relationships with doctors and the like. And so its incentives to try to innovate and offer things that would be different than its peers would be diminished.
Thank you, Ryan, for this comment on healthcare cases that we did review at the FNE, and the practical and legal challenges you face at the DOJ when litigating these cases before the court the past years. So moving to a completely different topic, but also challenging, I think the last topic to discuss today should be digital mergers. At the FNE, we are increasingly reviewing concentrations involving digital players and facing the challenges of merger scrutiny in dynamic markets. And on this, we are very attentive observers of both the US and EU developments to prevent anti-competitive concentrations. So Ryan, could you please comment a bit on which are the challenges associated when assessing mergers in digital markets, and what approaches are the agencies taking to overcome those challenges?
Sure, I would love to talk about this. Digital markets are fun to learn about. They're a challenge to analyze, and they're among the most important issues that we face as competition enforcers. A couple thoughts about the substance, and then a little bit about how we're approaching them. First of all, I think it's important to remember that digital markets and mergers in digital markets aren't altogether new. In 2013, the division actually sued to unwind the merger between two software companies, Bazaar Voice and Power Reviews. And if you look at the judge's opinion from that case, I think you will see that it reflects many of the issues that we've been discussing here this morning. And indeed, if you read it closely, perhaps the most notable thing about it is that the court explicitly rejected the question that the dynamic and evolving nature of the software market required a more deferential approach to the merger than what would be traditionally contemplated under US law. Now, of course, just how this all plays out does matter in terms of how the markets are actually operating. And I do think that there are a few issues that are more unique to digital markets than perhaps some of the others that we examine. First is the question of nascent competition. Obviously, nascent competition has been an important theme in US antitrust law going back to our Microsoft case, which was a dominance case 25 years ago. It was a feature of our more recent efforts to challenge the merger between Visa, a very large payments company, and Plaid, which was a new entrant in the online payment space. And I think that we will be in the digital market space constantly looking at questions of nascency and where the next competitive threats will be coming from. The second is scale economies and network effects. We recognize that there are complex relationships between users, buyers, and sellers on digital platforms and data more generally. And we have to understand how all of those fit together and whether there are high barriers to entry that may result from undue concentration in them, which I think leads me to an important point, and this goes back a little bit to one of the things that Pablo was saying before, is that in digital markets, we think particularly about exclusionary effects. in the context of mergers, as much or perhaps even more so than head-to-head competition. We're thinking about how is this merger actually going to change the structure of the market and potentially affect the ability of the acquiring firm to exclude competitors either now or in the future. And I think that in this context, it's important to think about markets holistically and not get too hung up on traditional labels about whether this is horizontal or this is vertical. You really need to ask the question of what is the nature of competition between the merging parties, or that the merging parties are engaged in more generally now, and how is this merger likely to affect that competition. Finally, I think it's important in digital markets to think about the concept of tipping points. One of my favorite quotes from literature is, how does one go bankrupt? Two ways: gradually and then suddenly. And I think that very much reflects the nature of competition in digital markets. What can look at one day as being a very competitive market with lots of choices and opportunities for customers can just a few years later be characterized by dominant firms or entrenched monopolies or oligopolies, where innovation slows, disruption is squashed, and consumer choice is limited. And it can be hard. It can sometimes be really hard to figure out what merger is going to be that tipping point, but it is something that we need to be sensitive to and are constantly looking at. So that's a few thoughts on the substance. In terms of how we do this, we keep learning. We talk to people in the industry, we talk to enforcers around the world, we watch how industries evolve over time, and we also, importantly, have recently looked for opportunities to bring this sort of expertise in-house. We're very fortunate to have Susan Athey, who joined us recently as our chief economist, and who has done a lot of great thinking about digital markets and competition in digital markets over the years. And we also now have a chief technologist, Laura Edelson, who we're working with to help us understand these markets even more than we have in the past.
Thanks, Ryan, for your interesting insights on the U.S. Holistic approach when reviewing digital mergers. We also keep learning at the FNE on digital markets, so it is good to hear DOJ is in the same path. So moving towards the European perspective. So Pablo, could you please comment a bit on how has the Commission addressed these challenges raised by digital mergers?
Great, sure. I will perhaps focus, because I think in terms of substance, a lot of what Ryan says resonates very much on this side of the Atlantic, right? So then, I mean, one aspect that I would emphasize is perhaps the vertical horizontal divide. So then that's absolutely true. So then one way to challenge that is to say, well, it is not because you label something vertical or conglomerate that is not going to be problematic. So part of addressing the challenge is taking seriously the prospect that a vertical or a conglomerate transaction leads to a significant impediment to effective competition. So then, I mean, if we take up two recent cases, Illumina Grail and the ongoing investigation in Microsoft Activision, I think there are very good examples of that in terms of, well, don't simply presume or don't simply assume that because something is or can be labeled in such a way that it will not lead to problems. And we see close scrutiny into transactions, even in those circumstances. But as I say, I mean, just to complement what Ryan was saying, I think there's another challenge that has been addressed in Europe and is more of a jurisdictional one, if I can label it this way, rather than part of the discussions, or a great deal of the discussions in relation to mergers in digital relates, as you all know, to the so-called clear acquisitions and the fact that these transactions may fall below the radar simply because of how the notification thresholds have been designed in merger control. And there has been a great deal of debate about whether merger control as originally designed and whether jurisdiction as initially conceived can deal effectively with potential or potentially harmful transactions in merger control. And there has been some consideration as to whether to change the threshold, follow different approaches, which has been done in Germany. And at the European Commission level, I think there have been two main measures that have been taken. So then one measure, I mentioned that at the beginning. So then the Commission has clarified its jurisdiction by stating, even mergers that fall below the national notification thresholds can be referred to us, and that would fill a gap. And the typical killer acquisition, so then the acquisition of a nascent competitor or the acquisition of a firm that has not yet developed a business model or that's perhaps too small to have a turnover that would justify a notification. All of these transactions can be now considered by the European Commission, and this is the question that is pending before the court in Illumina Grail. But if things go as suggested at first instance, this would allow to tackle that potential hole in the merger control regime by expanding the jurisdiction in effect of the European Commission. So then this is a jurisdictional means to address the risk of the so-called clear acquisitions being materialized, right? So that's one dimension of things. A second dimension of things, perhaps interesting from a comparative standpoint, has to do with the recently adopted Digital Markets Act. The focus of the Digital Markets Act is certainly not on mergers. It's about imposing obligations on the so-called gatekeepers when they are systemic enough to justify this sort of sector-specific intervention. But I will mention here is that on top of that, there's a specific provision on merger control that will not put in place a full-fledged notification regime, but that would nonetheless require and demand from these gatekeepers that have been designated in accordance with Digital Markets Act to keep the Commission informed about new acquisitions, right? So then there's a mechanism of updating the European Commission. This is provided for in Article 14 of the Digital Markets Act, is simply phrased as an information obligation, whereby the gatekeepers will have to inform the Commission of these acquisitions. And this will allow the European Commission in an innovative and a new way to keep an eye on the evolution of digital markets and to get a sense of how the landscape is changing and the extent to which these transactions are changing the landscape, and also get a sense also of the significance in quantitative and qualitative terms of those transactions. But I will bring my points to an end there.
Thank you much, Pablo, for your comments on how the European perspective on digital mergers is going between some regulation and also competition law. Well, thank you very much, Pablo and Ryan, for your time. I think this discussion has been fascinating for us. Hearing your experience on case law about CK Telecoms, Numana, Visa Plate, Illumina Grail, and relevant other cases you mentioned was particularly enlightening for us. And your comments, I think it provide us many takeaways, some food for thought. First, that although we can be faced to different antitrust landscape and legal traditions, when it comes to merger control, we are exposed to quite similar challenges on administratability of merger control, on solid or legal tests, on risk or remedy failures, and how to face court review and merger review to avoid traditional labels on digital concentrations. And I believe this exchange of opinions is illustrative to young antitrust jurisdictions, since we will be sooner rather than later faced to similar challenges, particularly on the digital arena. Our ability to move into the right direction will be better tailored if we are aware of how role model jurisdictions are fostering competition under these new market settings. So, well, we appreciate your time, and we want to again thank you for your thought-inspiring comments. And also thank to the FNE for making this event possible, and for our audience today. We hope you have enjoyed the discussion. Thank you very much. And just if you could stay a bit to take an official photograph for the four of us, it would be great. A virtual photograph, of course. Okay. Well, thank you very much to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Enjoyed the discussion. Have a nice day.
Oh. There we go. Do you have what you need for the photograph?
No, we're fine. We did just capture the screen, so it's
fine.
Oh,
did they? Okay.
that is the new way to taking photographs. Thank you. Thank you for your discussion.
Thank you. This was great. It was very nice to meet all of you. Ricardo, congratulations again, and best of luck with whatever adventures are next.
It was great. Great discussion. Thank you very much.
So,
Pablo. Thank you, Ryan.
okay, thanks, Pablo. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Francesca. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye, Ryan. Muchas gracias, Francisca, Ricardo, enhorabuena.
Muchas gracias, Pablo,
Muchas gracias.
por estar
Hasta
por la
pronto.
discusión.
Adiós.
Que esté muy bien.
Listo.